Yeah, we originally thought of it while we were trying to think of what kind of publication or book we might make to go with the show. But as I thought about it more, it seemed a very fitting way of thinking about my way of working, which is to use the paintings to bind together lots of different kinds of imagery, rather like an old-style Ringbinder, that almost obsolete way of putting lots of information together in one package. So I found this book in a skip in the 1970s and became intrigued by the very neutral, bland quality of the pictures that were there just to illustrate different kinds of surfaces and materials. And through the passage of time, they've become increasingly interesting because they seem slightly eccentric now. These empty office spaces or deserted plazas with strange concrete faces on them. So they become little pockets of urban space that I think they attract me because they're intriguing little capsules from a slightly different time that we're still living through. If you walked outside through the town centre of Sunderland, you'd find all these different buildings from different eras of post-war architecture, all huddled together, and I like that. I like that sort of adjacency that things sometimes have in cities. So my preferred method of research when I go to a place is to just go for long walks, collecting images as I go. And so I ended up with an extensive archive of little details of architecture, of industrial space, and also natural landscape around the city of Sunderland and down onto the coast, where there's a lot of space that's being recycled in various ways and reused for different purposes from its original intention. So if you take a walk through the old Dockland area, there's a lot of new light industrial units that have been set up, a lot of little enterprises, lots of people making different things, and I quite like that intensity of activity, and it becomes intriguing when you then look at images of those things. The huge broken clock that hangs over the station in Sunderland intrigued me because it seemed to be a token of a time where it's attached to a modernist, brutalist building, but is defunct. And it seemed to epitomise something you see a lot in the city centre, which is evidence of things kind of held in a state of suspended animation, almost waiting to be regenerated or reused for some new purpose. And there are these, as you walk around, there are these tokens both of the recent past and of things in transition. So, for example, one of the paintings is contains an image of a hand-painted mural featuring an image of Nicky Allen, who was murdered some years ago in Sunderland, and there's an ongoing police case about that. And when I came back to install the show, I found that the building had already gone, it had been demolished. So the whole place seems to be in some kind of state of transition. So I've lived in Tottenham in North London for about 25 years, and I live there because I find it a pleasant place to live, and I like living there. But of course, more generally, it's become associated with certain key events over the last few years, and in particular the recent riots that were inspired by police shooting. And it's astounding, really, when your locality, the places you pass on the way to the supermarket, the places you associate with the walk to the tube station suddenly become landmarks of political significance in a wider sense. And I'm irresistibly drawn to wanted to use some of that in the paintings, which anyway contain a lot of local places for me, places that have significance first as a sort of sounding board for your own musings, your own imagination as you're going to work in the morning, but then become perhaps freighted with some greater significance. So, for example, the actual inconspicuous, insignificant place where Mark Duggan was shot by police became the site of floral shrine for many months after the events, which was successively removed and then replaced. And in other respects, it's a completely insignificant sort of piece of fence by a bridge. So that places become invested with a little bit of history and a little bit of, a huge amount of personal significance for the people involved. As a young painter, I was quite envious of I had people that I was working with at art college who were making films, and I became quite envious of their ability to use time within their work so they could thread a narrative through the time-based medium of film, and they had that freedom to cut and to pan and to zoom in, and I became interested in how you might use some parallel strategies to that within paintings. So that was the point at which the paintings started to contain abruptly different kinds of space and things from different places pushed together, or abrupt changes in scale, to try and ape that ability to contain a narrative and a journey that the films have. I was aware that William Coldstream, who'd been he'd just retired as professor at the Slade when I was there, but he was still about, and an incredibly modest man, really. At that point, known for his portraits and landscapes and his role within what's sometimes called the Euston Road School of Painting, but he was very proud, I think, of the fact that he actually enabled the setting up of the Slade Film School that allowed people to explore progressive experimental forms of structuralist filmmaking. That was still going on when I was a student. But that came out of, I think, Coldstream's earlier involvement with a social realist impulse to talk about the lives of ordinary people and to depict and document places that perhaps hadn't had so much of a place within fine art. The outfit, I think, was actually known as Pop Rex, but they changed that to I came across this place, which was just across the road from the gallery where the exhibition is, in fact, but became intrigued by it. Somebody had told me about it, and it was clearly a site of, we were talking earlier about how buildings and places get recycled for new uses, and this seemed to be a brilliant example of an enterprising sort of reuse of a community central city centre space used by a group of musicians, but for events, for playing music, and for also, just for hanging out and meeting like-minded people. They had a drum kit on the improvised stage, which had the Pop Sex Limited logo on it, which I collected along with my archive of other images, like the giant clock above the betting shop, details of the famous bridge over the ravine, a memorial plaque marking the site of Riverside Industries. And I realised I had all these circular motifs So suddenly I had a connection back to the title I decided on for the show, Ringbinder, and it was a way of thinking about almost a circular tour of the city, and also connecting to the connective tissue of the paintings. I call them a bubblescape, and it's a way I've invented of holding lots of different elements, lots of pieces of imagery in their place within the painting, building up a sort of atmospheric density of the painting. A bit like we all have air surrounding us, otherwise we couldn't exist, our bodies would explode. We would have, we're only held in place by this invisible atmospheric pressure. And the bubblescape within the paintings has a somewhat similar role of kind of holding things locked in place so that they have a kind of narrative relationship to each other. Well, yeah, it sort of has twin origins, really. First, in my own sort of very local domestic experience, I was looking around for different surfaces, different sort of landscapes, micro landscapes I could use within paintings. And I was doing the washing up and looking at the detergent bubbles in the kitchen sink. And I like the way they continually dissolve and remake themselves, so you get gaps appearing. And I thought, oh yes, I can use this in a painting. So that's the origin of this kind of layered space that I have within the paintings. But I also came across a film by Jean-Luc Godard where there's a sequence where one of the central characters goes into a cafe and the camera follows him in and zooms in on the coffee he's stirring in front of his face as he muses on various things to do with his life and the state of the universe. But the camera zooms in increasingly into the bubbles on the top of his coffee, which as you get closer and closer, it's like watching some sort of nebula in outer space, dissolving, like stars being born or something. So suddenly there's this collision of something incredibly small and particular and mundane with something potentially cosmic. So within the bubblescape, you often get this network of tubes and conduits and something a bit like cables under tension. I often think of them as the skeletal parts of the painting, or the tendons and sinews. But it's a way of having a lot of drawing within the paintings, and a way of having apparently solid structures that poke through the different layers of paint. Importantly, within the paintings, there are often people. In the case of the people in the paintings in this show, there are people that I collected in images as I went on walks around the city, and I think of them both as participants in the action in the painting, but also perhaps a little bit like spectators or like an audience for other things that are happening within the work. Perhaps they're halfway between us as people, spectators outside the paintings, and the other images and stuff that's going on within the work. So they're kind of like brokers between us as spectators and the core vortex of paint and stuff that's happening in the work. This show's an important opportunity for me to give an airing to a lot of the objects which I've been working on alongside the two-dimensional paintings for years and years. And at first they came about through wanting kind of like playtime, time off from thinking about the normal composition, the normal rules of engagement of making a painting as I've evolved them. So if I'm confronted with painting an improvised object that I've made out of found containers and bits of stuff I might have around the house. It's like having to think about making a painting that goes around corners so that you don't have the normal constraints of composition or of the hierarchy of the imagery within the thing. So you're forced to improvise as the constructions are themselves. They're improvised out of very humble materials, the kind of things you'd find on street corners. So I really like that idea of reuse. But they also become mysterious containers of compressed space. So if you paint an image of a place on that container, you get this compression of different kinds of space, and also that collision of the macro and micro that is very important for the work. So I'm really excited about the opportunity to show at the Northern Gallery, because it's the most extensive exhibition opportunity I've had for some years, to show a range of painting and objects together. And inevitably you start to reflect on previous shows and where this work came from. And when I was a student, there seemed to be a lot of rules attached to painting. There was a lot of people had strong vested interest in painting, and that was the strength. That was testament to their strength of commitment to it as a medium, really. But also, it seemed to mean that lots of things were off limits, and it was important to me that the kind of painting I could remain engaged with was a container for all sorts of stuff, and I was allowed to talk about all kinds of imagery within the work, and that made it difficult to sort of navigate through a course through the various manifestations of painting that were available to a young artist at the time. A really important thing that happened when I was just a few years out of college, I guess, was the explosion of figurative art that seemed to suddenly mean that you were allowed to express a much wider range of engagement with imagery, from the kind of things you might find in graphic novels or comics, to express some sort of affiliation with photographic imagery, with film imagery, to directly depict all kinds of things that you maybe wanted to talk about, or things you saw about you. So it was really important that I tried to make painting that was a direct depiction of things. I think, I've lived through, I've been working through periods when painting's been really, really out of fashion, and then become incredibly popular again. And I think it's important to steel yourself as an artist against both of those sort of tidal waves in different directions. And at many points, people were always saying, "Why paint? Why? What's the significance of this now? You should be involved in some other kind of art." And I can only say that it always seemed to me that I had an appetite to paint, and that appetite was the only thing that would keep me driven enough to make new work. Whereas other things might be considered more worthy or relevant or topical, but it was that sort of bodily engagement with the medium that was the only thing that could really sustain me and kept me involved with it. So it was a struggle to keep the painting connected to what was going on in my life, but also had some kind of connection to other things I admired or was interested in other forms of art. So I've always been interested in any medium of art in that zone where it starts to approach another medium. So that I'm intrigued by the idea of painting that starts to approach the status or the concerns of film, and equally where it starts to approach some idea of performance or photography. And I think when you start to butt against the edge zones of a way of working, that's when it starts to get intriguing, because you're kind of stretching the envelope a little bit.